Well, hello and welcome. We are back again with another episode of our live series. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Really happy to have you joining us today. These interviews and training things that we do are just really enjoyable for me, and I'm sure hopefully for you as well. Our mission, of course, at the Alliance is to raise awareness about the issue of restraint seclusion in schools across the nation. And it's more than restraint seclusion. It's suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. It's a number of things that are being done to kids rather than supporting kids in appropriate ways. And our mission as the Alliance is really to educate the public and bring people together who are dedicated to changing minds, laws, policies, and practices so that restraint and seclusion are reduced and eliminated from schools across the nation and beyond. We've got a lot of viewers now in Canada and Australia and the UK, really all over the world, and we're really happy to have you as part of our community. Our vision is to see safer schools for students, teachers, and staff, and really far beyond that. You know, the mission continues to grow. We don't want to see these things being done to anyone, anywhere, and we appreciate that you're with us and trying to make some change. So today I'm really excited. As I've said before, I really enjoy the opportunity to do these interviews, and we have a fantastic guest with us today. We have Dr. Susan Hopkins joining us for a very special interview. I do want to remind you that we take questions in the interview, so feel free at any time to put a question in the chat box, and we'll be happy to kind of get to those as we can throughout the interview. Or if you have a comment, feel free to put that there as well. I do want to let you know that today's session, as always, is being recorded. So this will be available later to watch on YouTube or Facebook. We also make it available as an audio podcast. So those of you that have been with us before, you know how this works. I'm very excited to, of course, introduce to you my co-host for the day, Beth Tolley, and Beth is the Director of Educational Strategy here at the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Beth has been working really a career, on issues related to supporting children, and she retired in 2018 from a leadership position in Virginia's lead agency for early intervention of infants and toddlers. And of course, she has experience not only as a parent and grandparent of children that have had behavioral challenges, but also supporting a lot of other individuals and families. And this has really fueled her passion to improve the lives of children and their families through education, support and advocacy. So Beth, as always, welcome. It's great to see you today.
Thank you. I love being here and I love doing this. And I'm going to say something about the intro, that I am changing how I describe myself. Instead of kids who had behavioral challenges, I'm saying I have kids whose behavior challenged the adults, because as I learn more, I see it differently. So I'm going to introduce Susan to you. And I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Susan Hopkins here. I have been involved with a couple of I should tell you, do your lead in first. I'm just so excited about it. Susan's a passionate advocate for children, families, schools, and communities. She's the executive director of the MEHRIT Centre. And that is through SelfReg, selfreg.ca with Stuart Shanker. Over her 2 decades of experience in education, she has worked in many roles in kids in early years, K through 12, and post-secondary across context and places from Italy to the Northwest Territories, including roles of classroom teacher, program support teacher, vice principal, district coordinator for inclusion, researcher, curriculum developer, and post-secondary instructor. I don't think you're old enough to have done all those things. That's a lot. So she led the Northwest Territory implementation of the Early Development Instrument in kindergarten. She co-authored the 10-year Early Childhood Framework, developed the Northwest Territory play and culture-based kindergarten curriculum, and led the Planning Research and Evaluation Division for the Department of Education. In under 5+ years of her leadership, the MEHRIT Centre has evolved into a highly respected, accessible, and successful center for teaching and learning, SelfReg. She recently co-authored SelfReg School's Handbook for Educators and developed the online resources for the Principals Edition with Stuart Shanker. And I've now I'll say what I was going to say in the beginning because I got ahead of myself. I was so excited. So I've been participating in a number of the SelfReg offerings. There's a new monthly
Webinar.
Webinar, okay. That is just fascinating, pulling things together, tying. It's reframing. It's reframing what we have learned or what we knew in the past. And then Susan always follows Stuart's talk with unpacking it, and just amazing how you are able to redo what you're going to do based on what he just said that he didn't tell you before. So I am thrilled to have you here.
Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It's funny when you said that's a lot of stuff for your age. I just finished coloring my hair, and I said to my daughter, "Good look, 10 years younger." You know,
it makes a difference.
It
I said
works.
I'd never color mine until my granddaughter's kids said, "Oh, you're too old to be married to him," about my husband. But that's it, coloring the hair.
I just never thought about that. Maybe next time. That's something to look forward to. Well, Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We were getting an opportunity to talk a little bit before we started here, and there were many things that you said that really interested me. But let's talk a little bit at first about kind of, you have over 2 decades of experience, in the field of education. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey? Because I know even as we were talking earlier, you were describing, the different roles that you were in. And I'd love to hear about that journey, and also about it as it relates to kind of where you've ended up in terms of behaviors. I mean, we're really concerned about a lot of the negative things happening to kids: restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion. I'd love to hear about your journey through that lens as well, and what you've learned.
Yeah, it's interesting because the people I grew up with cannot believe I'm a teacher. And the people that know me now are like, "You were an at-risk youth." I dropped out. I did just about, the police were never involved, but short of that, you name it, I did it, and I really struggled in my I struggled in the younger years, but teenage years as well. So I had always sort of had this passion, and there were some diagnoses that came along the way. You may notice what some of them are as we move, and so I struggled, along the way to sort of, I don't know, find my way. I found my way into education, but I always had a passion for children that struggled. I always had this passion for children that struggled. And so I spent many years working in areas of inclusion. That's sort of what led me into the early years. And it's really how I first found Dr. Stuart Shanker. I always knew he has this saying, and you all will get a chance to hear a great interview with him and learn more from him. But he has this saying that there's no such thing as a bad kid. And I really believe that. But I also knew that I did things like see children with soft eyes over the years, and yet I wasn't able to change behavior. So I focused very much on trying to find ways to support children, trying to find ways to support families. I worked with marginalized populations. I advocated. I did all sorts of things in the area of education, and all those roles that you talk about that sort of wove together. But there was a gap. I used to think I knew what this thing called self-regulation was. I mean, I spoke about it. And I had learned about it, and I thought it was this idea of managing yourself, managing your things, managing your stuff, self-control. I had all of these sorts of ideas, but it didn't explain what happened when you didn't have, that sounds great. I joke about my Miss Vicky's potato chips. I have lots of self-control until I don't, right? So what happens when we don't? And this is the children that get in the most trouble all of the times, both the explosive and the ones that turn inward. And how do we see them differently? And then I discovered Stuart Shanker about 10 years ago now. And we worked together in a whole bunch of different ways. And he's the most brilliant scientist I know. He synthesizes, and he's just always thinking, and it's towards this goal of supporting children. And it showed me this new understanding of self-regulation that was really the original understanding of it, about how we manage stress. So much more than just how that simply sounds on the surface. And it was game-changing for me because it helped me. So much so that I moved across the country, and I've been living in a totally different province just to run his organization. It's my home now, right? In 2015, because the work was so important, because I just thought it was a game changer. It changed how I saw myself as a teenager. It gave me answers to all those questions that I was never able to answer. You sort of help kids to a certain extent, but what is the actual shift? And it's the science, and it's his work. So long story, but it kind of weaves together like a life of passion of trying to help the kids that struggle the most.
What do you think? I mean, how were you impacted? As a and that was, I really appreciate you sharing that, with us. But in your own journey, as a student that was having difficulty, how were you impacted, and how did that lead you to kind of want to make a difference for other kids?
Well, I just remember feeling so alone. I mean, there were some things that going on in my home. There were things that sort of connected to it, but I was actually kicked out of school at one point. I failed math by 149 out of 50. So that tells you how much the teacher liked me, and I felt very alone. In fact, I was always, it was a teacher that made the difference for me. A couple of teachers actually that made a real difference for me. And I wasn't, sometimes I read a blog on resilience, because sometimes we have this idea of kids that struggle and we think they struggle all the time, 24/7.
Right.
Well, I had a part-time job. I was given responsibility. I was actually pretty, I had these sort of two different sides to me going on at the same time. But I was really struggling, and I didn't feel I had anywhere to turn. For many years, I actually consider myself kind of lucky that I didn't get, to be honest with you, that I didn't get introduced to heavier drugs or anything like that, right? Because I was really a lost kid trying to find her way, too grown up in some ways and struggling. And so, the school, like, this is a long time ago. I'm 52. So, you're going back, 3.5 decades, 4 decades, but they didn't know how to deal with really, the behavior stuff in the high school was you were just put out, right? You had to conform or you were out. And, and like I had to go back and finish it in my 20s so I could go to university. So it really has sort of sat with me. And I've also seen children in my work as a teacher. Like, I consider myself first and foremost a teacher. And these children that we underestimated, or we thought they weren't capable of things, or they were, doing things that got them terrible, not nice things. Like, it's not nice things. I can think of a little boy once that took a lighter. He was flicking a lighter, and don't ask me why. This is when I was a vice principal. Don't ask me why the teacher didn't hear the flicking of the lighter. Like, I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but this teacher didn't. And he's flicking the lighter, which, anybody that begins to think about all of this stuff, even that sort of tells you something. What are you getting just from that flicking? And it lit the hair of another little.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. I mean, it was out in 2 seconds. But you can imagine the smell. You can imagine the whirlwind and the chaos that happened in that, right? And I still remember this little boy coming into my office. He really was. He was grade 4 at the time. He's a young adult now. And he just, everything I could read about him, like, he was in a complete and utter stress state. He didn't even know what he had just done. And people will hear me say something like that, and they'll think, oh, you're trying to let him off. No, no. But how do we help this young man through this and on the other side, right? And how do we see it differently? And, I still remember him, the shaking. And if I'd have responded, I mean, how I responded really mattered in that particular moment, because he would have bolted, he would have, acted out in certain ways. And how do we see these children that have these behaviors? And the explosive ones, but also the ones that go beneath the radar, which was me for a lot of years, right? Go beneath the radar.
Right. But you said something, and I'll be quiet in a second. So, but I know you're ready to go. But you had said something about, kind of, a teacher at some point that had kind of made a connection with you. And, of course, that gets the point that I'm always making about relationships and the how important these relationships are. Do you still remember that teacher that really was one of the first? Because it sounded like you said there were a couple that, began to, was that one of the points that helped you to?
Absolutely. And, the very first one, so I've told you about my teenage years, was just when I got in trouble, but I was really struggling in my younger years. I have my lovely daughter delivering me tea. So I'm going to take my tea, say thank you. Thanks, Sienna. She'd love to do a cameo and say hello.
She's welcome to. She's welcome to. Come say hello to us.
Anyway, my first was grade 4, Mr. Grant, and I actually reached out to him a few years ago. I found him. He'd be 75, 77. He's still, he was the first adult that ever treated me like a person. I don't know how to explain that, but it was game changing.
Isn't that a critical point, though? I mean, isn't that the critical point?
It is
game changing, and growing up in a house where, the opinions you were seen and not heard and all these sorts of things. And then I had a high school principal, and he was the one that was the vice principal. He would suspend me, but he kept telling me, you're better, you got so much in you. So I knew he believed in me. He liked me. He'd roll his eyes every time I got sent down to the office for something, He made a really big difference. And there was another teacher as well. It's interesting. Relationships, we've been talking about how important relationships are, like in education for decades. We all know that. But we gloss over what it actually means to a certain extent. It's not, I'm not suggesting that, all educators, I mean, if you're an educator, you get that your relationship matters. And we say that. But then what do we do when we don't have a strong relationship, right? It's interesting, like the science that we look at is called the interbrain, which I'm sure Stuart will talk to you about. But it's like imagining, I love thinking of this because it's like a Bluetooth. So it's Digby Tantum's work. And he's out of the UK, and it's like it's like a Bluetooth between people. We think of it as a caregiver and an infant, but it's equally it can also be online, by the way, right? I felt this sort of connection with Beth during conversations we had after the workshop she talks about. But it's like this connection, and we communicate. It's not just by the words. When we share a laugh, or we share a story, or you have this emotion. There's these connections, and we need those. Children who struggle especially need those. And so this idea of talking about the importance of relationships is an important one. If you're a teacher that you get relationships, and you have these kids that you've touched their lives and you've made a difference. Some of them you'll know, and others you won't, right? That relationship has been the conduit of everything. If we have kids that we don't have relationships with, those are the ones that can really throw us off. Mm-hmm. I find in the educators I work with, because we all care about kids, we just have different ideas about what we need to do, to support their well-being. Mm-hmm. That if you're a relationship builder and you can't connect with a kid, that can be very hard on us. And we don't even think about it, but it's actually our stress. And it's just, there's reasons, there's always a story, there's always more you don't understand, that for some reason that child just doesn't feel safe in all the different ways. And you keep working on the relationship in all sorts of ways. Because once you have that link, magic can happen, right? Mm-hmm. Magic can happen. So yes, they make a huge difference.
And I have, like, every time you talk, I've got 6 more questions, and then I forget them because I'm old. But there's one that particularly I want to hone in on. That's a 2-part question. So I think that we don't, and you and Stuart have talked about this, you can't tell by looking the level of stress. Some of the kids that look the most calm have this. He said something at one of the presentations about that they're in their sympathetic system, even though they look calm, and you don't see that. So you can't just look and know. So that was one thing, and maybe you could talk more about that. But let me say the next thing was this: how we teach teachers about relationships. I read the guidance that was developed by our National Technical Training Technical Assistance Organization. It was a set of suggestions for what to do to help reduce this disproportionality for kids with disabilities, disproportionality of punishment for kids with disabilities and Black and Indigenous kids, Black and Brown and Indigenous. And one of the things that it said is do greetings as they come in the door, but it explained it by saying, use this greeting as a mechanism to remind them of the rules and of the this and of the that. It wasn't interactional. It was, I'm going to tell, this is where you can tell them, what the expectations are of them. Not relationship, but that's how it's interpreted. Oh my goodness, how'd that happen? I got all these off.
So, you're not the only one that's old. I'm old too. So I'm already on to your next question with your first. Tell me your first one more time, because it was an important one, and I have an answer that might help folks with that one.
The fact that some of the research has shown that these kids who look calm, and you think that they're in parasympathetic state, are actually underneath, if you do the brainwave or the whatever it is, not brainwave, you see that they are really hyped up.
Well, and you have to remember, well, calm and quiet are not the same thing at all.
Yeah.
And it's why we have to catch ourselves when we, like, if you yell at a kid and you think all of a sudden they're being compliant. And I want people out there to know, we're human. So it's not about being perfect. We've all had moments. I've had moments, like, as a teacher and as a parent, like, but you recognize it for what it is. It's excessive stress and you don't know what to do about it, right? But we think that we suddenly got them compliant when we've actually shifted how their brain states function. And we've turned off the part of the brain that we would want to be really, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm really simplifying something that's very complex, but literally their brain shifts into a survival state. It's functioning in a different kind of way. And not only is the sympathetic system going out of your heart. So you think of a deer in the headlights, for example. So we think of that as a freeze, but there's also another response, which is actually a shutdown, and it's the heart rate slows way down, and it's an even deeper survival response. I mean, it's part of trauma, right? So it's survival, and we, I love Steve Porges' approach of thanking our bodies because, under these circumstances it does, but that is not calm. And actually, calm is a joyful, uplifting feeling, right? It's not quiet. It's totally different. So oh gosh, you can tell it's the end of the day. And so on to the second piece of things. Give me a cue word. Sorry, there's people online that I recognize.
Relationships. How relationships are taught or described. Greet at the door is one of the really good things that can be done to establish that relationship. But in this document I read, it was described as a means of reminding people what the expectations are.
Here's our problem with what we've done in education, in my opinion. And I've written curriculum. I've been part of strategies. I've been part of directives. I've been, and I'm not anti-program. Okay, I'm really not. There are some good programs out there. I've taught some good programs. I've incorporated some good programs, but we've somehow shifted. It's not just the age of accountability, which you folks all in the US have had your ripple effects with your No Child Left Behind, and things have had ripple effects here in Canada too. It's not just that. That's part of it. But we're getting to the point where we think the data is giving us answers, and we've really moved too far away from it, in my perspective, and we've forgotten. Teachers' professional judgment is something that I'm really passionate about. There's a lot of work on this out of New Zealand, and it is, really when they compare the data of what some test of whatever you're going to pull up thinks versus what we understand about a child, they're a teacher's professional judgment. They're actually pretty close. So again, I'm not anti-assessment. I ran research and evaluation for a long time, but I think we've gotten away from genuine being and connecting and living, and even the idea of curriculum. Like, I like curriculum as thinking of it, okay, yes, you plan, but if a meteor lands in the backyard and you don't stop and do something different, if it is June and there's a snowstorm outside and you just keep going, because it's the same with these relationships. So these ideas about the friendship, the taps and the different things, I think they're kind of cute, to be honest with you, but are they for everybody? No. And really, they're strategies in a bucket. We've gotten to the idea of where a little, a quick kind of idea is a strategy. No, a strategy has a goal. My goal is I'm trying to build a relationship with this child. Oh, I tried that. That didn't work. Okay, that's not a strategy. That's something you tried and you moved on, and maybe you do different things in different ways. And we as educators also have our own way of relating with people. So I used to try I'm not a fan of the sticker charts and all these sorts of things. I tried them as an educator. But what really worked for me was getting to know each and every child in different ways and listening. Like, it's not just an idea and intuition, like you said, Beth, that we don't know. But when we actually begin to notice, and really, first of all, you can look for some signs. You can see changes in pupils. You can see, like the boy CJ I told you about, when he looked I swear I could see the hair standing on ends. I could see his body poised, sort of in a fight or flight, I know the science. Bit of the future would tell me his legs were full of, there was more blood to the muscles of the legs so that he could dart if he needed to, right? So there is some of that, but we can also trust what we call our intuition is actually your stress system picking up the child's stress. So if something feels uncomfortable, trust that, right? I always think, you've got children that come into the classroom and you already know the moment they walk through the door. You already know. And maybe it's because you met the school bus and you saw something when they got off, or maybe it was just you sensed something. We should trust that. That's teacher professional judgment. That's at the universe. It's not, I mean, I know Stuart talks about education assistants and raises them up, and I agree, but also think of us as teachers as the universal person, the person that children spend most of their day with. That's our job, to figure out ways to connect. And when it's hard on us, just notice that for what it is. It's hard when I can't soothe a child. It hurts me. Like, it makes me uncomfortable. But that's a different thing than the child needs to change.
Yeah, you mentioned something that really resonated with me, and I have a background in science, so I appreciate data, but at the same time, there's a point where we don't need more data to know certain things, and there's a point where I remember a particular teacher who worked with my son, who had a clipboard, and every time my son did something wrong, she would mark it down on her clipboard, and he became tuned into what was going on. And I remember the day that he said, "Do you ever mark anything I do right?" Because he felt that under the microscope in terms of just having data collected, and that point about the importance of relationship is just so critical, and following intuition, and that may be systemically where some things have gone wrong in systems that we get more concerned and take away some of the autonomy behind people that might be really fantastic educators and able to connect with kids. But the other thing you said that really connected with me was the different states that a kid might go into. And I always think about Ross Greene and talking about kind of the lucky ones and unlucky ones, that if you're a kid who might shut down when you become overwhelmed, or cry, or have some other kind of stress reaction, you might elicit empathy. But if you're the kid who tries to run away or fights back or enters that fight or flight mode, you might be getting restrained, secluded, all of these negative things happening to you. And you're so right on that. If you're able to form those genuine relationships, I always get concerned when I hear people say, like, well, the behavior came out of nowhere, but you just brought that point up. It doesn't, right?
No.
So what do we do to change that? What do we do? If you're a teacher, and we have lots of educators that join us in these broadcasts, what do you do as an educator? I know you work a lot with teachers. How do you begin to work with them to begin to look for some of these signs?
Yeah. So, I think the first thing to tell you is that when I'm saying teacher professional judgment, I'm not suggesting a free-for-all, or no boundaries or no structure. And I really believe, I'm a strong advocate for self-directed professional learning as well. Like, we need to dive deeper. The thing that really changed for me, SelfReg resonated with me. So the understanding of stress, and we have 5 steps, or I like to think of them as 5 practices. But it was the science. It's like, wait a minute, right? How can I explain this? How can I see this differently? So, I think that's one of the things, is realizing it's almost like the reprofessionalizing of it, of not micromanaging every little bit. And that's really hard. And I'm sorry, I see a couple of I see a principal online that I know, Brad Hughes, right? And so I'm not trying to suggest that anybody at a leadership level is, usually people that are doing that, they're trying to control and make things better for kids. But what really works is engaging, like I personally find engaging with some of the science, learning a little bit more about it, thinking about how it applies in your context, and then taking some action. I also think we need, from a data perspective, we need to value not just the bums and seats kind of data, the quantitative data, the qualitative data, and thinking about it connected to purpose. There's a huge inequities. If you look at data, one of the things that I think should jump us into change and really reflecting is that, if you look at the rate of the likelihood of being, I wish I could pull up some stats for you off the top of my head, and I can't, but they're out there about, if you're, a Black youth, you are way more likely to be suspended, and over the same sorts of incidents, right? How does that happen? And is that just is that intentional? No, it's actually embedded into the way that we do things. So I thought about, I'm always interested in the how. My work in the Self-Reg is about how, and trying to think about how do we take this science, and okay, so it's nice to have, professors, and Stuart is like, you won't get any better than, like, honestly, every time I talk to him. Beth talks about how I keep up with him. Like I have to sleep for 2 hours. Last week I went to sleep afterwards. It's a lot to try to keep up. He says it's brilliant, inspiring, and hopeful, but also a lot to try to digest and make sense of. So I think it's like a really big key is to try to think of the science and think about how it applies. And it's very important that we begin. Many people begin thinking about what they can do to change the child or the youth, right? When I hear about your son asking that question, I instantly go to how quick is that? That's actually kind of a witty response. And so it's seeing the strengths in that. But what really matters is us adults. One of the one of the people in my community, Joe Persia, and I'm not sure if he's on here or not. He wrote a tweet last week that said, the child is only one dysregulated adult away. Like that stays with me.
I love it.
And when we hear that, educators, it's not to say, or parents, you think we need to move away from anger. And I understand the anger when you've had, I've heard some stories that are frustrating on both sides, and towards the schools and things. But I've never met an educator that really didn't care about kids. So if we start with these sorts of places of saying, okay, I fought once against success classes in a school board I was in, and they're called different things in different places. And I really believe in inclusion, genuine inclusion, not just co-location, genuine inclusion. And I still do. I really do. And and I think it's what's best, not just for those kids, for all children and for youth.
Absolutely.
And for societies as a whole. It's where we need to go. Saying that and believing that doesn't mean it's easy. I had somebody challenge me and saying, I believe it too. Show me how.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
And what I love about that is if we stay with that question, we honor it for what it is and say, that's something I haven't figured out yet. So maybe we run our success class for a while because we don't know what else to do, but we're not saying the kids need to change or conform. Because many of the young people that need the relationships the most, need high quality pedagogy. That's the other thing. We pull out and they're missing out on some of the rich pedagogy that for learning and the opportunities to, explore new things and create their own questions. And they get pulled out because people don't know what else to do. That's a different starting point.
Right. Can I share one quick thing with you? Just as you were talking through this, I wrote down a note and, I was hearing what you were saying about, what happens in schools. And the note I wrote down to myself was, one of the problems that we see happening with kids is the approaches are often very control and compliance based. It's all about compliance rather than being connection and compassion based. And as I thought that further, and there was something you said that triggered in my head that, this is the same thing that our educators need. Rather than control and compliance, the educators also need connection and compassion, this isn't just about providing something to the students. It's not necessary as well. It's like when you see people doing approaches that are really effective. I think about somebody like Matthew Portell and trauma-informed approaches. It's not just what you're doing for the kids, but also for this, the staff and the teachers.
Totally.
Yeah.
It should be the focus for leaders, right? You can't lend calm if you're not calm. Right. And sometimes we're just not calm. And I think we also have to I tell a lot of stories about being not calm when I'm out doing live events because it's easier and it's fun, but it also makes it safe for people. Like this is not, you learn this stuff and you never have what we call a red brain moment. You're going to have red brain moments, how to understand them differently.
Could you take a moment? I'm sure a lot of people may not be familiar with red brain.
Yeah.
Brown brain. Could you just explain that?
Yeah, for sure. So we use in our work, there's a whole lot of science that is synthesized to make the Self-Reg Framework, which is a 5-domain framework. It's biological, emotion, cognitive, social, and pro-social. And it's 5 steps or practices: reframe behavior, recognize and reduce stress, reflect, that's about interoception and becoming stress aware. And step number 5 is really all about restoration. But we synthesize a number of areas of the science. Stuart does. I try to keep up, right? And so there's a lot of Steve Porges' polyvagal theory is in there. Robert Thayer's energy tension matrix is in there, which is important because it ties in the physiology. The Gluckman's mismatch theory about, so there's all sorts of areas, the interbrain that I've already spoken to you about. But one of the cores is the triune brain, it's just a metaphor. And look, if there's neuroscientists on the call today, that there's not everybody loves the triune brain because, the debate that is actually an image of the brain. I wonder if I have my little handbrake. Bear with me. I use a glove, which is a combination of Dan Siegel's. I didn't have this one ready to go, but if you ever want to make these yourself, you go to a cheap dollar store or whatever and buy a red one and a blue one, cut out the blue thumb and you put it right over, right? And so Dan Siegel talks about flipping your lid. Yeah. Okay, and different, you're talking about Ross Green's work. It's the same sort of thing. These are different models of evolutionary models of understanding that our brain actually developed over evolution, and the certain parts of the brain are recruited under certain states. So we tend to think everything is blue brain, which you'll have to bear with me and believe that that's this part. So it's the neocortex. So it is what houses, anything that we would want: rational thought, its ability to feel empathy and take on other people's, perspectives. All the good executive functions, which are important, right? But delayed gratification, these sorts of things. But beneath that are it's the limbic system, which we share with mammals, and that's really, people think of that as the part of the brain that like fight or flight is, the amygdala is what calls out for the brain to respond. But it's so much more than that. It's really the part of the brain about connection with other human beings, right? So if we're in a group with 100 people and one of us gets scared because they see, God forbid, a tarantula, you'll feel that will go around the whole room instantly, right? And so that's actually the limbic brain's communicating. It's not words, it's not thought, it's actually beneath that. And then the reptilian brain is the brainstem, and it's the oldest part of our brain. And when we withdraw and go into a complete shutdown, it's the basic sort of functioning that keeps going, and it's that part of our brain that, like, we use the language of running the show. The thing is to remember that, like, I like thinking in terms of what to do is like, if you look at the SelfReg handbook, but you can also look up, even if you don't have the handbook, there's all kinds of free resources. I'll share a link. It's on Pearson. If there's anyone online that knows the link, it's Pearson Education in Canada. It's hard to get the book in the US. But like we think about, how to think about how to create a blue brain space. Dr. Jean Clinton talks about, you make the weather as a principal, you make the weather as a teacher, you make the weather as a dad guy, right? So that's sort of a neat way of thinking about, okay, how can I shift? You can see how everybody could go red brain under, certain elections or, heavy speech or something that people feel powerful, and get polarized on. But we can also do it in a positive way. Kids singing and connecting, or certain kinds of, like, for me, I think of music or a dance. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that we can do it in a positive way. So if you look online, there are resources where you can begin to think, it's a good way to stand back and say, okay, as an educator, even if it's just an idea, metaphor, how can I think about making this more blue brain? Which, like, it's not all Spock and logical. That means we're able to connect and feel one another. Our digestive systems are working, our immune system's online, and, we're in enough balance that we're resilient enough. We can handle a few bumps in the road and solve problems. And so long explanation. But I was going to show you this because Dan Siegel does Flip Your Lid. It's the same sort of science. He just talks about it. I think he talks upstairs and downstairs brain. That under a threat state, you flip your lid and the blue brain goes offline. And just uses the hand model of the brain, right? So it's kind of interesting, and kids like it, especially kids that get in trouble, because all of a sudden it's not, no, you were a bad kid. It's like, okay, what you did is not okay. You don't have to say it was okay. No, it's not okay. It's not what we do. That's not who you are, right? But you went red brain. Let's focus on
Right.
getting you feeling a little better first. Let's get the balance just through the relationship and being with. And then we'll figure out what we need to do to solve this problem.
I love that you brought. Go ahead.
I love the way you explained that and how to interact with the child who's gone offline.
I love the glove too. I'll let you know, Susan. I was talking to a educator in Canada that you connected me to recently, who during the conversation brought out his glove and put it on, and we were just chatting. So that's why I had a smile on my face when you brought the glove out. I'm like, we were talking about this just recently. That's right. That's right.
There is this discussion. I had it like one of my first questions, but I think now's a perfect place. You've talked about two things in the very beginning, or maybe I just thought about it, but I know you talked about how you can handle something one time and not handle it another time. Yeah. Kids are beat up all the time because the expectation of the adult is, you did it yesterday, you can do it today. What's the matter with you? And we have lived so much of our life unconsciously with that idea, all of us, that if you master a task, you mastered the task. And what the science is showing us, what you just talked about, is that it's going to depend on your state. And it's perfectly natural not to be able to do a skill you did one time, every time. But we do want to be more consistent. There's one statistic that Stuart has said several times about looking into that. You guys looked into self-reg versus self-control, the definitions, and how many of them defined actually self-control and how many were actually definitions of self-reg. I don't have those numbers in my head. Do you keep those numbers?
It's 447. It's a study in child development in 2016 or 15. Jeremy Berman and Stuart Shanker as well. So, and they looked at, because the problem is you Google self-regulation right now, you're probably going to get self-regulation of the media, self-regulation of business. All of us think that it means manage yourself. I get a report card in Ontario, and please, I hope they change these soon, that looks not so different from when I was a little girl, from my daughter, about, her ability to manage her stuff and organize things, and, and I've got I never got, the dreaded N needs to improve. But it's really funny. It's really funny because Stuart talks about Sienna as being like, she's actually taught her class over many times over the years. She first did it at 3 years old. Or in grade 3, they started talking about the brain. They said, who knows about the brain? And, up her hand goes, and she can tell you about red brain, and she can tell you, so she understands self-regulation as being understanding your stress. And like we just talk about it as managing energy and tension. It's oversimplified, but if I'm about to lose my temper and I go and take a few breaths by myself, that's a good thing. I've noticed what to do, and I've taken a few moments, right? And so what we do to kids, like I honestly, as an educator for a very long time, there's some really neat self-reggers on here that you may want to tap into. I see Lisa Pinorn and Brad Hughes. There's some neat people on here that are living and practicing this in all kinds of different ways. I'm sure there are others, but those are names that I'm seeing. But we've lived our, education. Like, why hasn't education changed? And again, I've been part of education for almost 22 or 23 years now. We've all been marinating, in this way of doing education. You look online, look at TV shows about what they portray of what it's like in a school. Look at how we learn. We about how reading is learned. We need to spend time with the research. I think we have a perfect opportunity right now, thanks to COVID, and I'm not really thankful to COVID for much of anything, right? To be honest with you. But we've disrupted some stuff. And I'm not suggesting throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's an awful lot of very good things happening in schools all over the place. But one of the things we have is this power differential that is really troubling. And I think it's time, really to disrupt and ask why and why now, and begin to, supporting educators who do, like when we revert to a self-control mindset. I mean, that I've had to deal with teachers that have a self-control means it's all within the individual. So it's an important, this stuff is saying the difference. It means it's all within the individual, and it's some version of those other 446 definitions were, self-regulated learning. So managing your learning, social emotional learning, which again, not anti-social emotional learning. These are good things, but what happens when they're not available and when they don't actually show up in the everyday, you teach about it and then it doesn't sort of shift. Executive function, managing your things, managing your stuff, managing your behavior. So it's managing. When really the original definition of self-regulation, the very first one, if it helps you, I tried to get Stuart years ago to change the term. I'm like, everybody is confused. They think it means what you should do and make a list of more to-dos. And he's like, I can't change the term, Susan, it's science. So, we get on trying to help people understand. If somebody starts saying things to me about self-reg or self-regulation, I always ask them, and I try to do it as genuinely and with openness as possible. What is your definition of self-regulation? And when I do that, I get, like I did it last week on a workshop I was on, and everybody said emotional rate, managing your emotions. No, believe it or not, it's not. It's not from the definition we're working with. And that's not to say all the other definitions are wrong or the programs that go with them. They're not. They're actually real definitions, but it's important we're talking apples to apples. And to me, the programs and the self-control ideas, that's what I worked with for years, and I could only get so far. We're understanding that there's this brain-body stress response system and these underlying states in individuals, and it's never just within the individual, it's always within relationships. It's never just one, it's within relationships. That's the game changer. Because all of a sudden, once you learn a bit of this, you begin to see differently, ask different questions. You stop looking for the strategy in the bucket. You stop thinking, why am I now? What more can I understand here? And I know that the kids who give you the hardest time, there's a quote, I don't even know who to attribute it to, are the ones who are going to, the ones who show you in the most unloving ways are the ones who need you the most. Right? And how do we stay with that and know there's science? There is science. That's the exciting thing to me about education and the shift we're at. To stand back and why am I doing this like this? Because it's always been done like that. Okay. And you want to go find, like why? And is this really about learning and the purpose of education and what we need as a society and what the children need? And even, honest to God, how the math, people that are worried about academics, this is good pedagogy is naturally self-regulating. The good approach to pedagogy makes a difference. And when you look closely at it, you will see self-reg and relationships embedded within it.
I love the why and why now. And that is at some contrast with what often happens, which is not why and why now, but which is what is the function of behavior, and what is the reward or consequence that I need to provide to get the child to meet the behavioral expectation that I have, rather than understanding it again, the why and why now. How have you in your in your career and doing the work that you do, how do you get people to begin to see beyond some of the methodologies that are very common out there? And again, I mean, I make this point a lot, but a lot of behaviorists out there don't care why. And I've had people say, I don't care why it's happening. I just want to change it. What have you done to help make that shift?
I'm not a behavior, my approach has always been relational and it's not behaviorist. I have a lot of people that I've come to have a lot of respect for over the years that I've worked with, and I'm trying to, learn. But the truth is what I see. I mean, this is just me speaking my frank truth, that I think that honestly, it is time for us to really, again, if you're digging into the science, and to begin to really rethink some of these things. And Stuart asks this, he always asks the question, how's that working for you? And I think it's actually a good question. And because it's like, if it is working, I mean, I always say, if you're doing a certain approach with children and it's working, but be careful how you define working, because we tend to define it from adults. I'm pretty moved. I follow the actually autistic Twitter feed, and just because it's one that I learn a lot from. I like to learn from others and from others' perspectives. Absolutely. And when you go in there and begin to dive into the perspectives on the things that we adults or we teachers may have thought were working, you're going to read about harm. And I think it's time for us to begin really unpacking that. If we start everything with some science and understanding that behavior is not a choice. Misbehavior, so-called misbehaviors, we want to think everything is happening, right? And they knew better, and they should have, and stop crying, and and like you said, Guy, with some of the children, it's easy for us to see. We talk about stress backpacks, so it's easy we know a little of the story, or you can use, for some reason, maybe it's a visible difference that makes it easier to see. But then there's those children. I always get people that say, "Oh yeah, I believe in this stress behavior stuff." But that kid, and it'll be the kid that punches somebody and then smiles, or says, "Yeah, I know I did that."
My son was a smiler. My son was a nervous smiler. Yeah.
Yeah. And when we go to functional behavior, so I've been trained in it. I've done it, but it only gets you so far. Right. So if I figure out the function of CJ's behavior, the kid who lit the lighter on the other boy's hair, okay, and so if you were to unpack that, it was 2:00 in the afternoon, it was math class, he hated math and he really struggled in math, and I figure out, okay, the function of the behavior is that he's trying to avoid math. Yeah, okay, maybe. Wow. So really we have a process where we go much deeper, but it's not a clinical process. It's one that all of us do. It's a universal, and we begin to say, why and why now? And it's not to the child. Like sometimes you can involve teens and things, but you're trying to understand it. Why and why now? What might have been adding to it? Noticing, beginning to unpack and thinking about the things you can do something, because we get stuck on what, the child comes to school with a can of Pepsi for breakfast, and we know they've been playing video games till half of the night, and then we're like, yeah, it's because of that. Well, no, I'm not great. We try to influence that, but you have them 7 hours, 30 hours a week is a lot we can influence change. And I think we need to challenge how we do, especially how we deal with the children that struggle the most, because those are the ones that we go the most self-controlled. Those are the ones that we go the most behaviors. Those are the ones that, like I'm working with I work with, I guess, a family. It's a school that I'm working with, and they're really struggling with this really kind of cool kid. And, everything is if then. And I have seen if then approaches to learning, or first then, sorry. First you do this, and then you get this. It's a reward system. I've seen it work okay. I've also seen teachers like tearing their hair out because they're running 20 different programs, and I've seen it not work at all. And, we never stop to think, wow, like, did you not, look at that child that was so engaged over here on this certain project over there. How can we bring the curriculum, seeing differently? And I think it's really time, and I'm not suggesting, I hope that I'm not offending anybody if you've spent a career dedicated to something like, I don't know, ABA, for example. I'm not taking away from you. You've made differences in life. You've committed to helping children, and you're trying to make a difference. It is moments like this that we begin to think, okay, what is really working? I've had people tell me it's this that was working. Right. And then I'm always like, Stuart's always, if somebody says, this certain program is brilliant, it's working great, go in and look. Every time you're going to see this interbrain connection. Right. You're going to see reframing behavior, that I see this child with soft eyes. You're going to see, oh, you're actually making moments to think about restoration, and that's the other thing. It's go, just so you can cope. And like, where's the fill up? The tank filling up.
Yeah, and you made the question of is it really working, and really being critical of that. I'm also a big fan of Alfie Cohn's work in terms of thinking about rewards and consequence, and that if your goal is short-term compliance, that you may get some short-term compliance, but is that really working? Is that working for the child? Right. And of course, by and large, I've got a lot of concerns about compliance-based approaches. And again, ultimately what we want to see is we want to help the child, but there's often, as Mona might say, and hopefully I'm going to channel Mona well here, but Mona de la Hook might say that oftentimes demands are placed on kids that they're not even developmentally able to meet. And, you think about brain development kind of happening in terms of kind of myelination happening from back to front, and of course, executive function and whatnot. There's often demands on kids that really outstrip their potential ability. And how do we change that lens? How do we get people to understand that sometimes the expectations that they have may not match what a child's ability might be?
Well, I mean, I think it's one conversation at a time. I think we need to have the brave conversations, right? I do think we need to, the biggest shifts that I see in people is when they can experience that they have a stress response system too. It's like if I could raise both of your heart rates right now. Maybe not, you're pretty chill, but I could get other people online and I could do something to make your face good, like I could. And also thinking about dialing things down. And so really,
you're getting me concerned here.
But really beginning to think about things. Okay. Yeah, thinking about things differently. And I agree we need to move away from compliance-based education. I actually feel like we're hitting a point. I think the equity, the things that we're facing. I mean, you would have seen the news what happened in Canada last week with 215 children, and it's just horrific, right? And and we have many of our own problems here, right? Black Lives Matter. There's so much that we need to do, and I think if we begin to marry the timing of the democracy, like it has been at risk, with equity, with the science of what's really learning, and beginning to realize that when teachers resort to how it's always been done, neurodiversity divergence is not a crime.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just brought that up because it seemed very relevant to what
and
we're saying.
Not only that, it's not something that we just tolerate. I mean, it's time for a different world. And when you begin to think, if you ask young people their ideas on how to solve some of these problems, let me tell you, they've got some answers. Right? So using this and making it safe for the people that, when I have worked with a teacher that has kids in rows and insists on silence, I can't come in and go, if I was a principal, I might, think about ways to support that. But I look at it, why now? And it is also about feeling, there's teachers that are afraid of somebody swearing at them. Once you realize the world doesn't come to an end when someone swears at you, and beginning to think about how to respond to these differently. But I think we need to all begin pushing a little bit more. Like I am passionate around, ever since you folks reached out, I saw something the last week, and I've heard people talk about these calming rooms and we get connected with calming. There's all kinds of people that think self-regulation, the work I do, is social emotional learning, where they think it's self-control, when it's really what makes both of those possible. We look beneath, right? But I've been shown these calming rooms, and I'm wary of them because the neurodiversity, there's also individual difference in terms of what calms us down. I'm not calmed down in a quiet room. I need to do something intense, and there's kids like me, right? So we're different. But many of these rooms are where they take the children that are in trouble, and all of a sudden you're looking at a room, and so if you have a room like this out there, do know that I'm inviting you to reflect on it. It's not saying that it's important nobody leaves feeling guilty. I think we need to think forward, but reflect on it. Because if you really mean it to be it's not a calming room. If it's a room, in my experience, those things always happen in the principal's office or right outside. That was the cool down place while, you waited to sort of deal with things. But now we have these rooms and they have some calming features in them. But that's where we're taking children. And, how are you ever going to calm down in a room where you were, the door was closed, or you were even forced to, just sit quietly, and versus, nonviolent interventions, these sorts of things, right?
And some of these are closets or padded rooms or concrete rooms. And the children in seclusion are put in there against their will, and the door is shut and held shut. And the thought that people, because you often hear that the child needed to go in there to regulate. The idea that a 6, 7, 8-year-old is going to be forcefully put into a room against their will and have the door held shut or locked. I mean, not only does it exceed the child's ability to be able to calm, I mean, the position that they're putting that child in, a fight, flight, it's absolutely horrendous. Children, especially very young children, need that presence of a calm, well-regulated adult to help them. So it's really painful when you hear these rooms being used in such a way to be calming and
And
in
I
fact,
hope
or anything
everybody
but.
on that, I mean, the first thing we just need to, it just needs to stop. When you think about, there's nothing regulating about being put in a room by yourself. I don't care if it has padded walls, and there's not when you understand what self-regulation is, you know, and I have compassion. I understand that there's people that there's situations. I ran safe and caring schools for Alberta for a year. I get safe schools. You know, I get that there is issues in that, you know, but sometimes we frame things and think about this is what makes the school safer. This is not what makes the school safer. This is actually cueing the maximum amount of threat where restraint. If I force you, you have something you really want to say, and I have use emotions on you to restrain you. It's excruciating and can do harm. Physical restraint from the very people that are supposed to be the support and the resources and the source of safety. Now, remember what I said in the beginning, just because we say that doesn't mean we have easy answers. But if we don't stay with that as our problem to solve and figure out, like the answers are upstream, it's sooner.
Right.
And it really is a holistic understanding in relationships. And we talk about havens, it's way sooner. But there, you know, as teachers, we find ourselves, we go red. You know, when I worked with schools that have done, you know, that police called and children that are 6 years old, right? You know, and kids, and it's heartbreaking. And you know, how do educators get themselves into those situations? It's more than they can handle, and they don't have the resources. But we don't even realize our view of the child and what we're seeing in front of us until we see that this child, you know, is struggling and they need us, that this is not the solution. And it absolutely, if you need some science, it's not regulating. There is not a single regulating thing about it. So
absolutely. Hey, Beth, I want to pause for 1 minute just to remind people that if you have questions or would like to ask questions, feel free to put those in the chat. We've been going for about an hour, and I do want to allow for some questions from folks that might be watching. And Susan, real quickly, if you can just kind of, I know we've talked about kind of your past and what you've been doing, but if we can talk a little bit about what you're doing now, what you're doing through the MEHRIT Centre. I had the really amazing opportunity to talk to a number of people that you connected me with over the past week or two that have worked with you and work with the MEHRIT Centre and just are doing amazing things. I'd love if you could share with our audience kind of what your passion is now and kind of what you're doing. And again, invite the audience. If you have questions, please put those in the chat.
So we're an organization. You can find us at self-reg.ca, and we also have selfregglobal.com, which is it's two people. It's Stuart and I basically, and one, you know, so we're just growing. But we work. We have an online school, so that's sort of one of the cores of what we do, where you can take all kinds of courses. You can take a school leadership course, early childhood course, foundations, which is understanding the science. There's parenting courses, a teen course, which is brand new. But we support schools, we support early childhood, we work with, we even work with some hospitals, we work with communities all across Canada. There's even a little bit in the US and some internationally as well. And it's always like-hearted people. You know, it's grown a lot in 5 or 6 years. We went from there being 3 people to there's about 50 of us now.
Wow.
And that includes, it's a core team of about 12 or 15, but that includes teaching assistants and people who facilitate courses and do workshops and things like that. But we are very much believe in community-driven approaches. We don't believe in one-size-fits-all or program. We use a framework, the SelfReg Framework, to support schools, organizations, all sorts of different groups. And even some that are going, you know, national organizations, as they begin to try and understand how to apply the science of stress and self-regulation, and you know, recognizing how it can connect to their goals, which is always about well-being and children thriving and supporting families and seeing differently. So we do all sorts of things. We have a monthly Twitter chat that you can join in if you like. There's live events. Our summer symposium is this year. It's our 7th annual, and about 40 people present some different element of it. And we have people participating from around the world, and very much all focused on, you know, Stuart's latest book talked about a just society, really understanding the science, applying it to what we know, relationship-based approaches, and supporting the well-being of all. So that's a little bit about what we do. Feel free to reach out. I'm Susan at selfreg.ca. I will do my best to, you know, if you're looking to connect with others or learn from others, there's some amazing people in our circle that I'd be happy to connect you with as well.
It's great work. And as I said, I'm doing these monthly things, and I've started the parent one also, the parent course.
Good.
Yeah, it's really, and I have the books, the Self-Reg and the Reframed. And the thing about, there was something, I can't remember which time it was I heard him say, and I think it's probably was there a long time before I heard it, was the reframe rather than refute.
Yeah.
And so when I think about that, because I think about how we're working so hard to change hearts and minds, but we can't get past the people, and we're seeing it in states across the United States where we try to get laws passed, and there's a group of leaders, educational leaders, unions, and some parents who are saying, don't take away my ability to restrain or seclude because I can't. We have to keep all the other kids safe. And we know that's not, we know that kids are less safe, and we have the science, we have the research behind it, but we're not getting the message across. And what I hear from Stuart and from you is we've got to find a way that we are finding what's common and how we can break through this that we're doing to get to, let's think about this together.
Yeah.
And figure it out.
And look, I am very happy to see every advocate out there shouting off the rooftops, because I think that's important. The more that we're hearing, the calls for change. But I'm also practical in the sense of, over the years, I've tried to advocate for, I was joking with you before we got online that, I've tried the approach of, I've tried dropping the 10 research studies, or, the research says, which of course you're never supposed to use that language, but it doesn't work. And when you actually look into how do we change human, belief systems, there's a whole field of science behind this. It is not easy. And what I'm always conscious of, and I sometimes forget it, but I really try to keep it in mind, is the goal. And so I want the well-being of, I want better things for children, right? I want educators to, I want schools to, I would love to walk into schools where everyone feels safe, and, and I can see how it can happen, and I can bring you some science together for how that can happen. But I can't change that person in front of me if I approach it in a way that puts up the walls. And that's really hard. There's a lot of change that needs to happen in education and sort of, in all sorts of areas. But the work you're doing in particular is very hard, because, every time I read a story in the news, like, my heart just, it really eats at you. But that's why it's so important. And that's why I honor both of you also for having the courage to kind of stay with this and keep moving forward. But it's getting those conversations. I mean, in one of my roles when I was a director in the ministry of, I really, I worked every way I could to get change in the early years. In the Northwest Territories when I was there, and I just kept diligently working. I was, and bringing the research, bringing it to life with stories, having boundaries that's where, I think if there's leaders out there and you are capable of saying, not in my school, right? That's not happening here. We need to figure this out in other ways, right? And, and it can start with little things. It's like saying, okay, well, why do we think taking away a resource or using it as a carrot and a stick is an okay thing? Let's have a look at that. These are little things we do that add up and accumulate for a child. And then all of a sudden we see what looks like it was an explosive behavior. Meanwhile, it was, it was the volcano building within. But I think it's important we keep having these conversations and we keep finding those middle grounds. Like, the policymakers need to hear you. Wow. When you put yourself in their shoes. So I tried to advocate once for, this is a safe schools thing, that I was too late. They'd already made the decision, but I did everything I could. That big school board that had spent $20,000 in very expensive surveillance equipment for safe schools. It was right after a tragedy in the US. And so it was a response. And, I tried to encourage them to, spend $5,000 and take the other $15,000 and let's invest in professional learning. Let's look at, understanding relationships and what actually creates safety. Kids need to feel safe to act safe. So I'm not saying that if you trust them and create more safety, that means you're not going to have any problems. But I want to bet you're going to have less to deal with. And that's where Ross Green's stuff is great. So it takes a lot of work. But let's say if instead of 30, I'm dealing with 4. Then I can give them my 100% focus, and I'm dealing with everybody else at the universal level, right? And so it's really kind of thinking about realizing that we do need these shifts. We need to keep having these conversations. But when I went to that group and I tried to advocate, like, I don't need to tell them they're hurting kids. They think they're helping kids, right? And there's misunderstandings where, and like, it's hard for me sometimes when I stand on the opposite of somebody that believes something very different, really hard. They think, oh, that child just needs, more punishment or whatever. It's like, no, but it's hard when I look at that other person, but I have to see that they actually really believe that. So we come together around the fact we all care about kids. We all care about making schools safer. Yes, and unions that can be great partners when we find our way to connect. We care about teachers' safety too, and their well-being. And I want teachers to feel joy. And if you chose this career, you're going to have days you pull your hair out, but it should be something that feels fulfilling and joyful. So when we can find something that we all agree on, okay, now but you've got to build the relationships first. Just like Guy said, the things we're talking about for kids are what we have to do with the adults we're working with as well. And finding ways, like, I mean, my approaches with government were, I had to put myself in their shoes. What matters to them, right? And try to figure out ways that we can find the commonality. Because the big fear is that if they don't have these, what's going to happen to that? There's this perception that this was an explosive behavior, happened out of nowhere, and no recognition that actually, if we'd have done a whole bunch of stuff a little bit earlier in the day, or recognize this is a really hard week, and we don't need to know every reason why. We trust ourselves, and what are some supports that we can put in place, and how can we think about this, and who's connecting with this child, and who's checking in on them? Some of the things we could do earlier, could we even cut them in half? Or even 10%, isn't that worth, I think it's going to be a lot more, right? But even, isn't that sort of unpacking and beginning to think, and really investing, our educators need to feel well, to be able, they can't lend their calm if they're not calm, and they're stressed out. No wonder. There's compassion for that one too, right?
I think of the teachers and other staff as being kind of like the position I had in middle management, that you could know what to do and what would work. But if you had top management saying, I want more productivity, I want more this, I want more that, I want, and the teachers, there have been these programs, these expectations with, the testing, the standardization, all kinds of things that are not good for kids or teachers. And so when we think of it from that perspective, we have been trying to do that, to try to partner with teachers, to have because I don't believe, I like you believe people are doing the best they can. And so it makes me think that, like you said, the policymakers need to understand the science and understand the implications of these laws they're making that are hard.
I find the best approach is finding ways for having people to feel that they notice they have that they can relate to themselves personally, like my joke about the these tips. I see there's a great question in there about how to explain practices aren't appropriate.
I actually had my cursor on that question, and I think you've been kind of answering part of that for a few minutes now, but I wanted to see if you had anything else to add to that.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one, and I'm not sure whether Bobby's asking this question as a parent or a teacher, but these are the sorts of things we do have a parenting page if you want to join a neat group. It's the Self-Reg Parents. It's a private group, but there's lots of folks that are Self-Reg, and it's parents to parents, so it's lots of folks in there that are taking courses and those sorts of things. But lots of parents just sort of seeking support. And the thing that I hear over and over again, and it, like, it's my version of my heartbreak when I hear some of these stories, is that, parents talking about their child not being understood. And it's hard on a parent. And so that's the first thing I'm going to say when you're, you just sense that your child is being treated unfairly and you're trying to advocate, and it's not an easy route. And especially if you've got a child that you've gotten phone calls over and over again, I know many that get a call every single day. Right. So, I think that there's no sort of magic approach here, but I do suggest that you know, continue to advocate. Ask, like, do not, you know, we sometimes worry about being a bug. No, bug, right? And ask for opportunities. I like leaving an article here. We have articles on ODD, for example, and Mona wrote a great article on ODD, which is, you know, so somebody's, you know, it's just, even if it's not a diagnosis of ODD, and you know, somebody's saying the child won't follow at all, like, it's interesting to begin to open up the conversation. But I think we can ask questions. Like, one of the biggest things that I have a habit, and I hope you haven't noticed it too much, of just talking too much, right? And asking and listening can really go a long way. Like I told you, I ask, how do you define self-regulation? And that's actually a really important question. And when you listen without, you're not ready there to go in and tell them how wrong they are. It's just, you'll see people go, you know, they'll struggle a little bit. So asking questions like, okay, well, what have you tried? Okay, so the practice is inappropriate. I mean, I'm assuming you're talking in general. If you're talking about seclusion and restraint, you can say that, you know, say that out loud. You're trying to get it to the highest levels and really affect change. And I mean, I worked in government for a long time. Letters get clocked, they get responded to, and keep, you know, that sort of thing. But if you're just thinking of a management perspective, and, you know, your child is constantly getting their recess taken away, or they're always on timeout, or, you know, I don't know, any sorts of things like that. And you may have a more serious version, but it's the same sort of thing. It's like, well, what did you try? You know, and beginning to talk about, so, you know, so what were the things that, you know, advocating for the supports, advocating for the things ahead of time, being the voice for your child, involving your child where your child is old enough and capable enough to sort of contribute, setting up times for those meetings. And you may feel like you're driving teachers crazy, but it is a parent role, and it's something that can really make a difference. So, you know, we have lots of schools. One of my daughter's schools, I volunteered to present at it multiple times, all kinds of free in kind things, and they never invited me until the parent advisory invited me. And they I said, you know, I have a daughter in the school. You're like, what? They didn't even know. So it was really interesting. So the parents brought me in, and it's not like you know, like, so I struggle with these things too. I'm struggling right now. And, you know, honestly, my daughter's grade 7 right now, right? And she's in a different school, and, you know, but I'm a presence, and I'm constantly asking questions, and I'm really trying to, you know, it's kind of like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but it's also when you keep the highlight. I worry about the kids that don't have a parent that is advocating. Right. And sometimes that's because they're dealing with so much themselves, right? And so if you work in the community and you're especially marginalized populations, and you can be that other person advocating with, we can make a difference that way. But I think it's keep asking questions, you know, getting it back to what good practice is. If you have specific questions, you know, pitch them out, and we'll try to sort of think about what the science is. But also really know there's this like-hearted group of people. There's this growing movement in science, and the science is backing what you intuitively understand. And as a parent, trust your intuitive sense as being right to something. We tend to not want to, you know, get in the way of schools, but we can also challenge things. If math for CJ was too hard, he really didn't understand it, and he felt very uncomfortable, and, you know, didn't want to be called out on the math, was part of it. You know, there was when he was flicking the lighter, he was actually getting a little bit of sensory input, right? There was sensory integration stuff with him, a little bit of sensory input that was keeping him, you know, settled. If I was at a talk with all of you, I would not be sitting at if one of you was giving a talk, I would be walking around the room, because that's what I need to be able to pay attention. My daughter's best friend doodles, and they wanted to get her to stop doodling, but you ask her a question, she remembers everything. So it's these things that we need to challenge, these status quo ideas that limit, and the lens. I do think the equity lens can help us, because you know, if it's neurodiversity, if it is culture, language, you know, religion, any sort of area that is a diversity, you know, we look at everything as being the same as we learned, as how I was for me when I went to school in Nova Scotia on the East Coast of Canada. No, it's a very different experience. And so really kind of challenging that in ways that stay in the conversation, right? So think of the window of tolerance. Don't push the other person out of their window of tolerance if you've actually pushed them away. You want to bring them closer, right? And keep the conversations going, and tell stories. Find people that can share stories and speak. You know, that is, if you want to look at policy change, can make a huge difference.
That is the third time. That's the third time I've heard that about the stories in the last week. I'm going to be doing NAMI Smarts, which is teaching people how to tell their story to influence many different things. There was also a session yesterday with Hear This Now organization. If you haven't seen that, that's a really great organization. And they talked about, that's what moves. Statistics don't move people. Yeah. Science doesn't move people. The stories do. Yeah. So, and then you're talking about it too. So thank you for that.
They do.
So a couple of quick questions here I want to try to get to. Okay. This one from Violet says, my son moves impulsively when he's dysregulated and people think his movements are intentional. Does Self-Reg Framework recognize and address such circumstances, or is it more about preventing the dysregulation through relationship?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. So we have 5 steps. So it's, reframe the behavior, recognize and reduce the stress, and then reflect, enhance stress awareness. So that's having your son notice that. So it's a really important one, right? So how many times have we told children, we hear that our children maybe are told to suppress something. So suppress an emotion, suppress a, movement, the hands are flapping, or, the wiggling, or any of these sorts of things. And when we understand it from the lens of self-regulation as a brain body, the brain and body are always trying to find balance, homeostasis, right? In all these different areas, it's actually serving a purpose. And so, no, it's not stuff that down. It's be curious about it. Why and why now? In some cases, we might be advocating, so the hand flapping is an example. So we might be advocating for normalizing that and making space for that. And absolutely, that should be just something that, it's not something we're trying to move anyone out of. It's something we're trying to realize, okay, that's actually regulating, that's self-regulation, and it's not maladaptive, it's growth promoting, because it allows the child, the teen, the adult to stay in the conversation, to stay with the learning, but it's also telling you that the stress is increasing. So as somebody that's trying to understand the stress of others, you can see the signs of when, my daughter, she reverts to, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this, but she'll still sometimes put her thumb in her mouth. Not very often, but she's done it a few times in the last couple of weeks. And it's the stress of everything to do with the COVID lockdowns and things like that. And I haven't seen that for a couple of years. So I could go, don't do that, or whatever your teeth and your orthodontist, but it's just information for me, right? So no, first of all, embrace it. If it's something that is a maladaptive mode of self-regulation, so I mean, we all have those, right? Like, what do you do to, to make stress manageable for a little bit of time, right? So I joke about my Miss Vicky's chips, for example, and I mean, there's a exact crunch and salt and sugar, and and I have an urge, and an urge is actually a stressor, right? So it only happens at a certain amount of times. But I might say, okay, that's not the greatest way to deal with it. I'm not trying to self-control myself into a diet. Sometimes I go and eat the whole bag. But I do know that when I eat those, then I feel tired, I feel worse the next day, because my body it's working to get that as a stressor out of my body. So, if our children are doing things that are allowing them to cope, embrace that. Okay. If it's maladaptive and you think it's actually causing more problems, and we really need to get away from the things that is about optics, because optics are other people's problems, right? Like, if I'm doing something that seems a little weird to you and I'm not hurting anybody and it's not a problem for me, then that's actually other people's issue, right? So, but if it is something that is a maladaptive mode, like, getting stuck on video games for too long could be a maladaptive mode, then we want to recognize it for what it is. It's a source of regulation, but it's maladaptive because it's causing more stress and you're actually left more depleted. So we try to find ways to move it to more growth promoting things, or at least a little bit, in positive ways. So I hope that answered.
Let me just play onto that, because I could state that like we want to teach them a replacement behavior because that behavior was not good for them. That's the language of PBIS, but that's not what I'm hearing you say.
No, and I'm not a fan of that. Like, I've worked in PBS or PBIS schools as well, and it's, I had a colleague once help me understand that they do look at environments, and I really believed in environments in whole school, so I believe in those sorts of things. But no, I'm not suggesting a replacement behavior. It's about understanding and doing it with the child, right? You're not trying to change anybody's behavior. Behaviors do change. It's what's really interesting is when you change what you're seeing and you make space for it. You know, if I was to tell my daughter to stop, all I did was notice it, right? And she's like, "Oh yeah, right," you know, and so we're making space for it. We're not. It's very much within the relationship. This is not a program or a scripted kind of approach to things.
And I would say what I hear you saying is not my goals imposed on you, the child.
No.
It's you ask the child, is this working for you, or is it adding more stress? And then if they say it's more stress, then you may work together on finding a way.
Or even just noticing it, right? Yeah. Co-regulation is not about me reg you for the rest of your life. That's just behaviorist, right? So it's it's me, creating safety through boundaries and conversations. And, like if you ask my daughter, she'd say, "You're always talking to me." I am, right? But I also pick my moments. I know the teachable moments, and I'm, I have this rule that it's happy, healthy, and safe. And so and I know that's very vague, but I try to not make too many decisions. And then the ones that I actually do, they just are what they are, and they're done with love, right? So it's really, I invite parents, if you're like the example from Violet, your child's not moving impulsively. His body is moving. Okay, so it's a reaction to the stress. There's no thought. He may not even realize why he's doing it. And it's allowing him to feel better. It's keeping it within the window of tolerance, right? I'm actually not, I'm sitting in sort of a cross-legged sort of way, and it's allowing me to stay present and with you as well. So it's really having those soft eyes. And, sometimes it might be really dysregulating for us if they're like, right? But that's a different problem. That's us realizing, okay, that really makes me uncomfortable. Finding your moments when you can say, how does it feel when you're all wiggly and those sorts of things. But really what you're focusing on is, it's like the idea of, people talk about fidgets, and I talked about the fidgets became this fad with toys and things like that. But sometimes they're actually genuine. And my daughter, like I'm using the example for her, she had for a long time, not anymore, she sort of stopped. She used to make these little squish balls with sand and balloons, and the teacher didn't want her to bring these to school, and 'cause she says they're just toys. But how I know it was a fidget for her was she would read and the ball, right? So what you're doing is think about what really matters, what are the most important things. Think about the hills to climb. If your child's struggling, you're going to work like there's certain things that are just their ways of regulating. That is something that's happened to them naturally. You don't learn self-regulation. You're driven to self-regulate. Our brain and bodies self-regulate. There's no readiness for it. It's just we're trying to think about more growth-promoting ways for children that are not naturally showing that. Some children will be finding their own growth-promoting ways already. Others, the kids that we're talking about, are the ones that have no idea how to find their calm when they're losing their red brain. They have no idea how to get back there. They could pair it off to you, "Oh, I'm calm. My engine's running just about right," but right? So it's really relational and with heart. And when you screw up, say that. Just say, "Oh, I wish I'd have handled last night. It raised my blood pressure too. I wish I'd have handled that better, and I didn't. And I love you." And you know what I mean. And that's actually also laying that relationships can be repaired. That this is about being human, and you'll see the changes start to come.
I love that. I think it's so important. I mean, one that, we have our own, we're not always perfect, but to share that with kids and, again, one of the things that concerns me, it's not just about how kids are sometimes treated in schools, but how kids are treated in life, sometimes more as possessions to control rather than relationships to grow.
Right. So the child is part of this.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think we can honestly look at the human rights documents and begin to think about that as part of our advocacy with governments, for people that are trying to advocate up. These things are in writing, these things have been signed on to. Do we really believe them, and why?
Yeah. And unfortunately, we've been lagging in some of those. So, it's time for change.
Yeah, it is. And I love the science because it's hope. right? To me, that was the magic thing when 10 years ago when I first found Stuart. And there are others that in this realm that have moved me, right? That you've mentioned several today. But Stuart, the way he synthesized it together, it just suddenly made things about my life make sense, and it helped me. You know, my mom, before she passed away, she passed away a couple of years ago, and she said to me, "You're so different than you used to be," because I was so intense, right? And you know, I've been told, we talked, Beth and I joked, because I had a colleague that used to call me Scrappy Doo, right? And in a good way, I guess, most of the time, but sometimes it was, you know, and I think that beginning to recognize that I'm human. And, oh, you know, and that's a cue that I need to actually shut off the computer and go have an evening, and that, you know, stopping the wearing like a badge of honor and working 70 hours a week, you know, and that realizing that, that especially those of us that are in the work at the well-being of kids, whether it's your own kids as parents, and some parents have more work, you know, they just, there's more on their plates than other parents, or whether it's you're in education or you're in healthcare. That we also, like, it's that idea of the being on the plane, you've got to put on your mask first. And it is not a selfish thing to prioritize a bit of self-care. And I mean, I was a single mom for a lot of years. People would say, how do you find it? Well, if it's a few minutes, it's a few minutes. But even just knowing that you can do that, because that's an important part of all of this. It's got to be not just do. There's got to be some be too, right? You know.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation,
Yeah.
and you know, I say every time we do one of these that I really enjoy the conversations that we're able to have. You know, you talk about you know, the inspiration that you've gotten from others, and certainly can share with you. I mean, you are inspiring to all of us, and I imagine all the people that will be watching this, you know, really appreciate you taking some time to join us and share your experiences. And I love just the you know, the fact that you kind of shared your story about how you know, kind of came to where you are now and the work that you're doing to affect change. So want to thank you. And Beth, I don't know if you have any final thoughts to share.
I will just say I am so appreciative of your unselfish sharing and the wisdom that you have and how you explain things, because I think it's going to help us all. And I want to do it again.
I'll come back anytime. Be careful. Be careful.
Make sure you write that down, Beth. We're going to be contacting Adam right away.
We have it on tape.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. We really appreciate it. And we're going to be talking, of course, next in our next session to Dr. Schenker. So we'll hear more from what you're doing there, you know, at the MEHRIT Centre. So thank you so much again. And I'm going to let you and Beth go. I've got a couple announcements here to make.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys. All right. And I hope everybody enjoyed that today. I had a quick announcement to make in terms of what's coming up next. You know, again, thank you all for joining us today. You know, we do these because we want to really get good ideas out there of things that we can be doing to, you know, help our kids and help others do better. To, of course, you know, eliminate all the things that we're doing, like restraint seclusion to kids, and really better support them. So appreciate you all joining us today for this. I do want to mention to you that we've got another session coming up in 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, we will be talking to Dr. Stuart Schenker. So also with the MEHRIT Centre, and we're going to be talking more about Self-Reg. And actually, this is a recorded interview. We recorded this about 2 weeks ago. So this one will not be live. But you'll be able to join us live and watch it. And we really look forward to that. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.